Hundreds of everyday household items are about to get a lot more expensive thanks to President Trump's trade war and specifically the steel and aluminum tariffs.
Foreigners are not paying for President Trump's tariffs. That leaves U.S. consumers and businesses shouldering nearly all of the additional cost.
On June 4, 2025, President Trump stunned markets by announcing a 50% tariff on imported steel and aluminum. Branded as a shield for American industry, the move quickly turned into a global shockwave. And unexpectedly, Coca-Cola, a brand that has lived in American refrigerators for more than 130 years, became one of the first to feel the hit. Coca-Cola relies heavily on aluminum imports from Canada, which supplies nearly half of America's demand. Overnight, the tariff doubled production costs, and CEO James Quincy didn't mince words, calling it a direct hit to both the company's operations and the wallets of American families.
All these items contain steel and aluminum. They were previously excluded from Trump's 50% tariff, but that is now changing.
The Can Manufacturers Institute echoed the warning. Aluminum prices would inevitably push up the cost of canned drinks. A potential solution, switching to PET plastic bottles, came with risks of its own, alienating loyal customers and sparking backlash from environmentally conscious consumers. Packaging is not just a container, it is brand identity, and Coca-Cola knows it better than anyone. But Coca-Cola is far from alone. Craft breweries with razor-thin budgets now face the choice of raising prices or cutting production. Campbell and other food manufacturers brace for higher costs in every can they produce. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans will see the evidence of this policy every time they pick up a soda, a beer, or a can of soup. And even if the U.S. restarted every idle smelter, domestic output still wouldn't meet demand. The crisis has gone beyond price hikes. It's now a looming shortage, a choke point threatening multiple industries at once. The Trump administration insists the tariffs are necessary to protect national security and revive American metal industries, but trade partners like Canada, Mexico, and the European Union view the move as a direct provocation, preparing retaliatory tariffs of their own. At home, economists point to Federal Reserve studies showing that previous steel tariffs didn't create new jobs, they destroyed them as companies struggled with higher costs.
The president slapped a 50% tariff on steel and aluminum. Originally, this massive tariff applied to just the raw materials, but now it is going to apply to a wide range of goods.
Coca-Cola, caught in the middle, is scrambling on two fronts, experimenting with packaging changes while quietly lobbying Washington for exemptions. Yet the White House remains unmoved, portraying the disruption as a temporary sacrifice for long-term strength. But the question is unavoidable. Who pays for this sacrifice? It's not the policymakers, it's the businesses, the workers, and the families already battling rising prices. Coca-Cola cans, once a symbol of American familiarity, have become symbols of uncertainty. Rising prices, fragile supply chains, and growing international backlash all point to one truth. In a globalized economy, no protectionist policy can stand alone without triggering ripple effects. The story of Coca-Cola is not just about packaging or soda prices. It is a warning that when a so-called shield turns into a burden, ordinary people feel it first, at the grocery store, on the dinner table, and in every can of Coca-Cola they lift from the shelf.
The big three automakers are not happy. They say a deal that charges lower tariffs on Japanese imports than on North American cars with high American content is a bad deal.
Trading problems between our nations, ideally by Labor Day.
He says it would be unreasonable for Canada to have an agreement that looks worse than the new U.S.-Japan deal that sees auto tariffs cut to 15% from 27.5%.
The United States has just signed a new trade agreement with Japan, slashing auto tariffs from 27.5% to 15%. On paper, it's a deal between Washington and Tokyo, but its impact has shaken Canada to the core. Why? Because every percentage point cut for Japan pushes Canadian-made cars further out of the U.S. market. Factories in Ontario are suddenly the expensive, less attractive choice. And yet, while Tokyo lobbied aggressively and secured this breakthrough, Ottawa stood still. Prime Minister Mark Carney keeps repeating promises of fair negotiations, but every day Canada's key industries are being squeezed harder, and people are losing patience. The numbers speak for themselves. With Japanese cars entering the U.S. at just 15% tariffs, Canadian exports are collapsing. In the second quarter of 2025 alone, auto exports to the U.S. dropped by over 30%. General Motors Canada reported a staggering 35% decline in quarterly profits, while Stellantis posted a $2.7 billion net loss in just the first half of the year.
Well, if we want to compare ourselves to Japan, Japan buys approximately $79 billion worth of products off of the U.S. We buy $359 billion, so we're 400% more, even higher than that actually.
American lawmakers made it clear Japan earned its concessions through relentless diplomacy. Canada, meanwhile, didn't even make it to the negotiating table in time. Senior U.S. senators have openly said that Canada must prove it deserves equal treatment. For a country that once prided itself on being Washington's most trusted trade partner, this is a humiliation. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, whose province is home to Canada's largest auto manufacturing plants, didn't hold back. "We can't sit here and watch factories slash jobs because our federal government failed to protect us. Why is Japan getting a better deal while we get ignored? This is a blatant diplomatic failure." Alberta's Danielle Smith echoed the anger. "We talk about Buy Canada, but without real policies to protect our industries, that slogan means nothing."
We should never take a backseat to anyone in the world, especially a backseat to President Trump. We're an economic powerhouse around the world, and again, we're their number one customer, and they need to start respecting their number one customer.
They're taking matters into their own hands. Ford is urging provinces to prioritize Canadian-made vehicles and cut down on imported U.S. parts. Alberta is bypassing Ottawa entirely, opening direct talks with American companies to sell oil and energy components. The anger isn't confined to political leaders. A Nanos research survey shows 64% of Canadians believe Ottawa has failed to defend national interests in trade talks. Social media is exploding with the hashtag #BuyCanada, but the tone is bitter. We're buying Canadian cars, but is Ottawa doing anything to protect Canadian jobs?
In response to U.S. tariffs and President Trump's threats to annex Canada, 71% of Canadian consumers say they intend to buy fewer American products this year.
Dealers have reported a 12% jump in Canadian-made car sales in the past month as ordinary citizens try to support local industries. But it's a desperate move, not a solution. If manufacturers keep cutting production lines and laying off workers, no grassroots campaign can save the sector. Mark Carney's assurances of ongoing negotiations sound hollow when factories are already cutting shifts. Reports from Washington suggest Canada might be forced to accept a tariff deal even worse than Japan's if it doesn't act quickly.
We'll be reinforcing those discussions over the next few days in Washington with the United States. We are looking for the best deal for Canada.
Doug Ford summarized the frustration bluntly in a recent press conference. "We're the U.S.'s biggest customer. We buy more American goods than Japan, China, and France combined. If we can't use that leverage to protect our own industries, then what exactly is Ottawa doing?" Every month of delay costs Canada jobs, revenue, and credibility. And while premiers push for real solutions, Ottawa appears bogged down in endless meetings and vague statements. Canadians don't need more speeches about working hard, they need results. Japan and the EU are signing favorable deals with the US, while Canada, the country with the deepest trade ties to America, is being left behind. Premiers can shout "Buy Canada" all they want, but without decisive federal action, those words will echo in vain. If Mark Carney keeps stalling, the real question won't be how many jobs Canada loses, it will be when Canada quietly becomes just another US-dependent economy. And by then, national pride will be nothing more than a memory.
U.S. President Donald Trump says he has struck his biggest trade deal yet, and he's agreed to a trade framework with the European Union.
We've reached a deal. It's a good deal for everybody, I believe.
The United States and the European Union have agreed to a new trade framework. At the center of it, a 15% blanket tariff on most European goods entering the U.S. pharmaceuticals are exempt. But steel and aluminum from the EU will still face the steep 50% tariff imposed under national security provisions. In exchange, the EU committed to $750 billion worth of energy purchases from the United States and pledged $600 billion in new investments. They also agreed to significant defense procurement, although no figures were disclosed. This deal is not a binding treaty. It's a framework, announced just days before a 30% tariff was set to take effect. That timing wasn't accidental. It followed the same pattern we've seen in other Trump-era negotiations: pressure, then deal.
$750 billion worth of energy. To agree to invest into the United States $600 billion.
It's 15% tariffs across the board, all inclusive. The investments Mr. President just described, and the purchases over there. Indeed, basically the European market is open. It's 450 million people.
This isn't a one-off. We've already seen similar structures in deals with Japan, the United Kingdom, and Vietnam. In each case, Trump threatened steep tariffs. Then, after days or weeks of speculation, a framework was announced, usually built around a 15% baseline tariff and large-scale investment or procurement from the foreign side. This model flips the trade conversation. It's not about removing barriers. It's about creating predictability and charging for it. Trump's 15% now feels moderate, simply because the alternative he threatens is always worse. That's not trade liberalization. It's transactional stability. And the pattern is clear. Allies, competitors, everyone pays. Now, all eyes turn to Canada. A 35% tariff is scheduled to take effect on August 1st if no deal is reached. Ottawa has made it clear. The deadline is political, not legal. And they won't be rushed into a bad agreement. But the EU and Japan were longtime US allies too, and both had to accept Trump's terms. Canada knows that. And while it hasn't signed any framework, it's not sitting idle. Canada brings leverage to the table. Over $1 trillion in investment into the US, a deeply integrated energy and auto supply chain, and decades of cross-border ties with key American states. Alberta's oil, Ontario's parts plants, these aren't abstract advantages. They're real points of influence. Carney's government is watching the sequence, not resisting it. The strategy isn't to be first, it's to be smart. The federal government has already moved to manage public expectations. Early promises of a good deal have shifted into a more realistic message. This will be about managing trade-offs. The lessons are clear. No country has secured full exemptions. Baseline tariffs are now the floor. And rushing into a vague framework, like what Japan and the EU accepted, might avoid pain in the short term, but lead to problems later. Instead, Ottawa is preparing, working with provinces, identifying sectors that need shielding, and exploring room for targeted offsets. Trade diplomacy is still happening, just not on Trump's schedule. Trump's trade system isn't built on trust. It's built on leverage and price tags. But that doesn't mean Canada has to fold. It means Canada has to design, shape a deal that protects what matters most, whether that's auto, energy, or digital trade. The real danger isn't delay, it's giving in too early for too little. In this new world, the countries that hesitate might get hit. But the countries that rush, they might get locked into terms they regret. And Carney knows, better to sign the right deal late than the wrong deal too soon.
Yeah. So, August 1st is going to come. We haven't really had a lot of luck with Canada. We have the confines of a deal with China. But we haven't really, we don't have a deal with Canada.
It's the middle of summer, but the temperature between the United States and Canada has never been colder. Just days ago, President Trump signaled something few expected to hear. The US may no longer be interested in reaching a new trade agreement with Canada. Instead, he hinted that tariffs alone might do the job. The message was simple: Washington is done waiting. As he boarded Air Force One for a trip to Scotland, Trump's decision marked a turning point. With the self-imposed August 1st deadline fast approaching, the United States is preparing to hit Canadian goods with a 35% tariff unless a new deal is signed. But on the other side of the border, Canada isn't blinking. Prime Minister Mark Carney and his team made their stance clear. Canada will not sign a bad deal, no matter the pressure. At the heart of the current standoff is a paradox. The Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, or CUSMA, is still in force. Under this agreement, over 90% of Canadian exports to the US face zero tariffs, assuming they comply with rules of origin. But the reality on the ground is shifting. Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, and auto parts remain in place with some rates as high as 50%. And now, with the threat of an across-the-board 35% tariff, Canada faces a second layer of economic pressure that exists outside the CUSMA framework. These measures have had a chilling effect on Canadian industries and raised questions about whether the U.S. is still honoring the spirit of its trade commitments.
I think the president is trying to up a little pressure on Canada. We saw this in the case of Japan as well. So I think he's still posturing a little bit, trying to create an environment where Canada might be willing to give up a little bit more.
This isn't the first time Trump has used tariffs as leverage, but this time, Canada isn't giving in. The Prime Minister's position is supported by provincial premiers and trade officials. Their consensus: a rushed deal made